July 14th, 1976, Bastille Day. A small village in eastern France erupts with the sound of shattering glass, crackling flames, and gunfire. Inside a burning house, a 61-year-old man clutches a pistol and rifle, firing desperately at shadows moving outside. Within minutes, the flames consume everything. When firefighters finally extinguish the blaze, they discover a charred corpse barely a meter long, arms and legs burned completely away, skull split open, holding weapons that fired their last rounds into empty darkness. His name was Joachim Peiper, and 30 years after World War II ended, someone finally made him pay for his crimes. This is the story of the SS officer they called the Beautiful Beast, and I'm warning you now, what he did during the war and how he died will leave you shaken. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. For decades after the war, Peiper lived comfortably, worked respectable jobs, and walked free while the ghosts of thousands haunted the places where he committed his atrocities. The journey from Hitler's golden boy to a burning corpse in rural France is one of the darkest tales of justice delayed you'll ever hear. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because we're about to uncover a story that shows what happens when evil thinks it's gotten away with everything. January 30th, 1915. Berlin, Germany. A baby boy was born into a respectable middle-class family from Silesia. His father, Waldemar Peiper, had been an officer in the Imperial German Army, fighting in the campaign in German Southwest Africa before being wounded and contracting malaria. This military heritage would shape young Joachim Peiper's entire worldview. He grew up in a household where duty, honor, and German nationalism were sacred values. His father raised him and his two brothers to believe in Germany's greatness, to see military service as the highest calling, and to never question orders from superiors. Young Joachim, called Jochen by family and friends, wasn't a brilliant student. His grades weren't good enough for university. But in 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power and Germany began its transformation, 18-year-old Peiper saw his opportunity. He joined the Hitler Youth with his brother Horst. The next year, he enlisted in the SS. This wasn't just any military service. The SS was the elite, the true believers, the ones who would build Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. And Peiper was exactly what they were looking for. Young, physically fit, ideologically malleable, and ambitious. In 1935, at just 20 years old, Peiper graduated and was accepted into the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, originally formed as Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment. This was the cream of the SS, and Peiper had arrived. He was good-looking, clean-cut, intelligent, and he caught the eye of someone who would change his life forever. In 1938, Peiper joined the Nazi Party officially, and by 1940, he had been selected to serve as personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler himself, the Reichsfuhrer SS, the man who controlled the entire SS apparatus and who would orchestrate the Holocaust. Picture this, a 25-year-old SS officer working directly for one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, sitting in meetings where the systematic extermination of European Jews was planned and discussed. Peiper witnessed these conversations. He saw the documents. He knew what was happening in the East. And according to post-war testimony, he never objected, not once. While serving on Himmler's staff, Peiper met and married Sigrid Henriksen, one of Himmler's secretaries. They would have 3 children together. Peiper was building the perfect Nazi life, career, family, ideology, all aligned. But Peiper didn't want to remain a staff officer. He wanted combat. He wanted glory. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Peiper rejoined the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. As a company commander, the Eastern Front would reveal who Joachim Peiper truly was, and what it revealed was a man who loved killing. His unit fought in the south, around the Black Sea and Taganrog. Peiper's aggressive tactics impressed his superiors, but cost his men dearly. He didn't care. Casualties meant nothing to him. Victory was everything. By 1943, he commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Then came the 3rd Battle of Kharkov in February and March 1943, and this is where Peiper earned his reputation for brutality. His battalion was ordered to break through Soviet lines and rescue the encircled 325th Infantry Division. Peiper developed a new tactic, His armored half-tracks would attack villages at night from all sides at full speed, machine guns blazing, firing at every building. The straw roofs would ignite, creating panic and chaos. Peiper loved it. The flames, the screaming, the absolute terror his unit inspired. They started calling his battalion the Blowtorch Battalion. Some claim the nickname came from his aggressive tactics, but Soviet survivors told a different story. On February 17, 1943, Peiper's unit arrived at the village of Krasnaya Polyana. They found the bodies of German soldiers who had been killed and mutilated by Soviet partisans. Peiper's response was swift and merciless. He ordered the entire village burned, every building, every home, and he ordered that anyone they found should be shot. Women, children, the elderly, it didn't matter. In his mind, they were all partisans or partisan sympathizers. His men poured gasoline, lit matches, and watched the village disappear in flames. The exact death toll remains disputed, but witnesses reported dozens of civilians massacred. But that was just the beginning. 5 days earlier, on February 12th, Peiper's regiment had occupied two villages, Yefremovka and Semyonovka. Retreating Soviet forces had wounded two SS officers. On February 17th, the SS returned for revenge. They rounded up the villagers, 872 people, men, women, children, infants. They separated them into groups. Some were lined up and shot. Others were herded into the village church in Yefremovka. Then the SS troops locked the doors, poured gasoline around the building, and set it on fire. 240 people burned alive inside that church. The screaming could be heard across the village. Only one person survived to tell the story, a 14-year-old boy named Ivan Kiselev, who managed to escape through a window. For these actions, Joachim Peiper received Germany's highest military decoration, the Knight's Cross, on March 9, 1943. Heinrich Himmler personally congratulated him on a live radio broadcast, calling him "My dear Joachim." Nazi propaganda portrayed Peiper as a brilliant tank commander, a natural leader, a man who made quick decisions and inspired absolute confidence in his men. The SS newspaper Das Schwarze Korps praised him as the master of every situation, bold and unorthodox. They made him a hero, and Peiper loved every second of the attention. Over the following months, Peiper's unit continued its rampage across the Eastern Front. In November and December 1943, during fighting in Ukraine, eyewitnesses reported that Peiper ordered his men to take no prisoners. On December 5th and 6th alone, his unit killed 2,280 Soviet soldiers who had surrendered. The village of Pekartshina was completely destroyed. Its inhabitants burned alive with flamethrowers while Peiper watched. By January 1944, when Hitler personally presented him with oak leaves to add to his Knight's Cross on his 29th birthday, Peiper was physically and mentally exhausted from the nonstop killing. SS doctors examined him and ordered rest. Even by SS standards, the violence was taking its toll. But here's what makes Peiper's story so complex and disturbing. While in Italy in 1943, he discovered that Italian authorities had captured a group of Jews and were preparing to hand them over to the SS for deportation to death camps. Peiper intervened. He had the Jews released into his custody, then set them free. One was a rabbi who later wrote testimony about Peiper's unexpected mercy. How do you reconcile this? A man who burns children alive in churches in Ukraine saves Jews in Italy. The human capacity for contradiction defies understanding. Perhaps he simply enjoyed having the power to decide who lived and who died. In September 1943, Peiper's forces were involved in another atrocity at the village of Boves in northern Italy. When Italian partisans captured two of his soldiers, Peiper demanded their release. When the partisans refused, he ordered reprisals. His men shot 23 Italian civilians and burned the village. After the war, Italian prosecutors tried to charge him with war crimes for the Boves massacre. But in 1968, courts in both Italy and Germany concluded there was insufficient evidence. Peiper walked free again. By December 1944, the war was clearly lost. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Americans and British were closing in from the west. Hitler conceived one last desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge, and leading the spearhead of the attack was Joachim Peiper, now commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of 117 tanks, 700 vehicles, and nearly 5,000 men. Hitler expected Peiper to reach the Meuse River in days. Peiper was determined not to disappoint his Führer. On December 17, 1944, the second day of the offensive, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was racing west when they encountered an American convoy at the Bauernese crossroads near the Belgian town of Malmedy. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, rear echelon troops, not hardened infantry, was heading south to join the 7th Armored Division. Peiper's tanks opened fire, destroying the lead and rear vehicles and immobilizing the convoy. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered. 113 men threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Here's where accounts diverge. Peiper himself had already moved westward, continuing the advance. He claimed later he left the prisoners in the hands of his subordinates with orders to send them to the rear. But what happened next would make Peiper's name infamous in America. The SS soldiers assembled the American prisoners in a field. They stood there unarmed, hands raised, waiting to be marched away. Then someone gave an order. Machine guns opened fire. The prisoners fell screaming. SS soldiers walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who moved, executing wounded men with bullets to the head. Some Americans played dead. Others ran. A few escaped to the woods. But when the shooting stopped, 84 American soldiers lay dead in the snow at Bauernese. Over the following weeks, as Peiper's Kampfgruppe continued westward, they murdered more prisoners. American POWs, Belgian civilians, anyone who got in their way. By January 13, 1945, when Peiper was finally forced to retreat, his unit was accused of killing 362 American prisoners of war and 111 Belgian civilians in various locations across Belgium. The atrocities were so systematic, so brutal, that American troops began refusing to take SS prisoners themselves, shooting them on sight in retaliation. Peiper's offensive failed. He lost all his heavy equipment and returned to German lines with only 800 of his original 5,000 men. But for his efforts, even in defeat, he received the swords to his Knight's Cross. Hitler's regime was collapsing, but they still had time to decorate the SS officer who had murdered prisoners. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, Peiper was ordered to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. He ignored the order and tried to make it home on his own. American forces arrested him later that month. The Americans put Peiper on trial at Dachau, the site of the infamous concentration camp, in May 1946. He was tried alongside 73 other members of his command for the Malmedy Massacre and the other killings during the Battle of the Bulge. The trial was controversial from the start. The prosecution relied heavily on confessions from German prisoners. The defense claimed these confessions were obtained through torture, through mock trials, through physical abuse that included beatings, broken bones, and worse. Some of these allegations were later substantiated. The investigation had been flawed. Some interrogators had used excessive force. But here's what's undeniable. The bodies of 84 American soldiers were found at Bauernese. Autopsies showed that many had been shot in the head at close range after they had already been wounded. Belgian civilians testified to systematic murders. Survivors of the massacre testified about SS soldiers walking through the field, executing wounded men. The evidence was overwhelming. On July 16, 1946, the verdict came down. Joachim Peiper was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. So were 42 other defendants. 22 received life sentences. The rest got prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. But Peiper never hanged. American public opinion began to shift. Questions about the interrogation methods grew louder. A U.S. Senate committee investigated and found significant problems with how evidence had been collected. Senator Joseph McCarthy, representing Wisconsin with its large German-American population, became involved and pushed for commutation of the sentences. In 1951, Peiper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He spent years in solitary confinement, 5 years on death row, not knowing if each day would be his last. Then in 1954, his sentence was reduced to 35 years. And on December 22, 1956, after serving 11 and a half years in prison, Joachim Peiper walked out a free man. He was 41 years old. An underground network of former SS officers found him work at Porsche, then Volkswagen. Peiper worked as a car salesman. Think about that. A convicted war criminal responsible for hundreds of deaths, selling cars to ordinary Germans who wanted to forget the war and move on. But by the 1960s, West Germany began prosecuting war crimes again. The statute of limitations kept being extended. Former Nazis began naming names, trying to reduce their own sentences. Multiple witnesses testified that Peiper had ordered or participated in massacres on the Eastern Front. Karl Wolff, Himmler's senior adjutant, named him. Werner Grothmann, who had succeeded Peiper as Himmler's adjutant, named him. The testimony piled up. Peiper claimed it was all lies, fabricated by Soviet agents seeking revenge. In 1972, fed up with the renewed investigations and what he called Germany's betrayal of its war veterans, Peiper moved to France. He chose Traves, a tiny village in Haute-Saône in eastern France, population barely 200 people. He bought a house in the woods, a secluded property with his dogs for company. His wife Sigurd had developed cancer but often stayed with him. His adult children visited occasionally. Peiper worked as a freelance translator under the pseudonym Rainer Buschmann, translating military history books from English to German for a Stuttgart publisher. He lived quietly, he kept to himself, and he thought he was safe. But he made one critical mistake. Despite using a pseudonym for work, he registered in the village under his real name, Joachim Peiper. In 1974, a former French resistance fighter recognized him. He contacted the French Communist Party. For 2 years, communist historians researched Peiper's background, digging through Gestapo files, confirming his identity, documenting his crimes. On June 21, 1976, the French communist newspaper L'Humanité published an article with a damning headline. "What is this Nazi doing in France?" The article detailed Peiper's war crimes, the murders in Ukraine, the massacre at Malmedy, the deaths of Soviet and American soldiers and civilians. The village of Traves erupted. Some residents had suspected Peiper was hiding something, but most had no idea they were living near a convicted war criminal. Someone threw eggs at his house. Paint was splattered on the walls. Threatening letters arrived. Someone spray-painted on walls in the nearby town of Vesoul, "Peiper, we're going to do July 14th for you." July 14th, Bastille Day, France's national holiday, a day celebrating the overthrow of tyranny. The threat was unmistakable. Peiper contacted local police requesting protection. They assigned him a guard, but only during daylight hours. At night, he was alone. The German embassy in Paris recommended that Peiper leave France immediately. Friends urged him to return to Germany, but Peiper refused. He had grown to love his isolated house in the French woods. He refused to run. Perhaps he thought the threats were empty. Perhaps after surviving so much during the war, he believed himself invincible. Perhaps some part of him knew that justice had finally caught up with him, and running would only delay the inevitable. On July 13, 1976, Peiper received multiple threatening letters and phone calls. The threats were specific now. They said his house would be burned, his dogs would be killed. There was no direct threat to kill him, but the implication was clear. That same day, Peiper's wife Sigurd left in their BMW. Some sources say she had a long-standing arrangement to visit a friend in Strasbourg. Others claim she went to stay with their son in Frankfurt. What's certain is that Joachim Peiper sent her away, knowing danger was coming. After she left, Peiper wrote 2 letters. One to Rudolf Lehmann, the former chief of staff of his division and a personal friend, saying his quiet haven had become an entrenched camp and that he hoped to move in autumn, if the communists allow me to wait until then. The second letter was to another old friend. In both letters, Peiper's tone was resigned, almost fatalistic. He knew they were coming. July 14, 1976, Bastille Day. As France celebrated, a group of armed men approached Peiper's isolated house under cover of darkness. Exactly who they were remains unknown. No one was ever arrested. No one claimed responsibility, at least not immediately. The next day, a group calling itself the Avengers would take credit, but French authorities never identified them. Some believe they were former French resistance fighters. Others think they were communists fulfilling their threat. Still others suspect former prisoners of war, Soviet or American, who had survived Peiper's brutality and tracked him down for revenge. Around 1 a.m., the attack began. The assailants moved quickly and methodically. They approached from three directions simultaneously. They smashed windows. They threw Molotov cocktails through the broken glass into the hallway and other rooms. Gasoline-filled bottles with burning rags stuffed in the necks. Crude but devastatingly effective incendiary devices. The house erupted in flames almost instantly. Investigators later found evidence that fires had been started from three separate. Inside, Joachim Peiper grabbed his weapons. He had a .22 caliber rifle and a pistol. He ran outside, firing at the shadows moving in the darkness. Spent shell casings found at the scene confirmed he discharged both weapons multiple times. But he was alone, vastly outnumbered, and the attackers had positioned themselves strategically. Peiper fired into the night, but at what? At whom? Something terrified him. Witnesses later speculated that he saw how many attackers there were or realized the house was already lost. He retreated back inside, perhaps thinking he could defend himself better from within, perhaps hoping to grab something valuable, perhaps simply panicking. We'll never know his final thoughts. The flames spread rapidly through the wooden structure. The smoke became thick, choking, deadly. Peiper's dogs were wounded in the attack. 4 bullets, 6.3 5mm rounds from a small caliber pistol, were found in the blood-stained kennel. The attackers had shot his dogs, but hadn't killed them outright. Whether Peiper heard their cries over the roar of the flames is unknown. As the fire consumed the house, Peiper remained inside, trapped. Whether by choice or circumstance, he couldn't or wouldn't escape. The intense heat, the smoke, the flames, they all closed in on him. His last moments must have been filled with the same terror his victims had felt. The villagers in Yefremovka burning alive in their church. The American soldiers gunned down in the Belgian snow. The Soviet prisoners executed in Ukrainian fields. When firefighters arrived and finally extinguished the blaze hours later, they found a scene of complete destruction. The house was reduced to a charred shell, and in the ruins, they discovered a body, or what remained of one. The corpse measured barely 1 meter long. The arms were gone, the legs were gone, burned completely away. The torso was blackened and shriveled. The skull was split open. In the corpse's remaining hand-like appendages, investigators found a pistol and rifle, positioned as if the victim had been defending himself until the very end. The autopsy revealed smoke in the lungs, confirming that Joachim Peiper had been alive when the fire started. He had breathed in the smoke and toxic fumes. He had died from asphyxiation, not from the flames themselves, though the heat had subsequently destroyed his body. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. When Peiper's widow Sigurd arrived to claim the body the next day, French authorities had more bad news. The body had been mutilated post-mortem in the morgue. The head was missing. When it was finally returned, the skull had been split into pieces with only a single tooth remaining intact. Whether this was done by attackers, by someone with access to the morgue, or during some investigation remains unclear. The disrespect shown to the corpse mirrored the disrespect Peiper had shown to his victims' corpses 3 decades earlier. The investigation into Peiper's death went nowhere. French police interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, but made no arrests. The group calling itself the Avengers was never identified. No photographs were ever published of masked men claiming responsibility, despite some sources mentioning such images. The case remains officially unsolved. But the truth is, nobody tried very hard to solve it. Peiper was a convicted war criminal. He had been sentenced to death once before. Many people in France and elsewhere felt that justice had simply been delayed, not denied. French newspapers barely concealed their satisfaction. Some headlines celebrated the death openly. The public sentiment was clear. Peiper had it coming. The London Times ran the headline, "Avengers kill SS Colonel in France." 3 days later, British newspapers reported that cars full of sightseers converged on the village of Travis to see the burnt-out house, to gawk at the scene where the notorious SS officer had finally met his end. The spectacle was macabre. but it reflected public fascination with the idea that war criminals could never truly escape their crimes, that eventually justice catches up. Joachim Peiper's body, or what remained of it, was transported to Germany. He was buried in the cemetery of St. Anna's Church in Schondorf am Ammersee in Bavaria, alongside his father, mother, and his two brothers, who had both died tragically. Hans Hasso from tuberculosis after a suicide attempt left him in a vegetative state, and Horst from suicide after allegations of homosexuality. The Peiper family's history was marked by tragedy and shame. So who was Joachim Peiper? Was he a brilliant military commander, unfairly prosecuted for following orders in the chaos of war? Or was he a war criminal who got exactly what he deserved? The answer depends on whether you believe soldiers can be held accountable for atrocities committed under orders, and whether 30 years is long enough for justice to be considered satisfied. What's undeniable is that Peiper's hands were soaked in blood, civilian blood, prisoner blood, the blood of unarmed men, women, and children. Whether he personally pulled every trigger or lit every fire is irrelevant. He commanded the units. He created the culture of brutality. He tolerated, expected, and encouraged war crimes. At Malmedy Massacre, even if he didn't directly order the massacre, he bore command responsibility. His subordinates knew what he wanted. Take no prisoners. Move fast. Don't let anything slow you down. Those American soldiers died because Peiper's Kampfgruppe saw prisoners as a burden, not as human beings entitled to protection under the laws of war. On the Eastern Front, the evidence is even more damning. Multiple witnesses testified that Peiper personally ordered villages burned with their inhabitants inside. He was described as particularly eager to execute the order to burn villages. The nickname Blowtorch Battalion wasn't given affectionately. It was earned through systematic destruction. But here's the uncomfortable question that makes this story so morally complex. If Peiper deserved to die for his crimes, and most people would agree he did, why was vigilante justice acceptable? He had been tried, convicted, and sentenced. His sentence was commuted through legal processes, however flawed those processes might have been. He served his time, however inadequate that time might seem given the magnitude of his crimes. When he was killed in 1976, he was a private citizen living legally in France. His killers were murderers. They burned a man alive in his home, without trial, without due process, without any legal authority. Does the fact that their victim was a war criminal make them heroes or criminals themselves? The answer reveals more about us than about them. Many people celebrated Peiper's death. They saw it as poetic justice. The man who burned villages burned in his own home. The man who showed no mercy received none. The man who executed prisoners was himself executed. There's a certain symmetry to it, but if we celebrate vigilante justice against war criminals, what standard are we setting? If Peiper's killers were justified, then any killing of any person deemed bad enough by someone becomes justified. The rule of law dies. Society descends into vendetta and revenge. Yet the alternative is equally troubling. If legal processes fail, if war criminals walk free after token sentences, if the victims never see justice, then what? Are we supposed to accept that some crimes are simply too large to punish adequately? That mass murderers can serve 11 years and then live comfortably selling cars? The Peiper case forces us to confront these impossible questions, and the answers aren't clear. What is clear is that the victims of Joachim Peiper's crimes deserve better. The 872 villagers murdered at Yefremovka and Semyonovka deserve justice. The 84 American soldiers executed at Malmedy deserve justice. The 2,280 Soviet prisoners shot in 2 days deserve justice. The hundreds of other victims, whose names we'll never know, deserve justice. They got 11 and a half years of Peiper's imprisonment, then 20 more years of him walking free, working, living, enjoying his secluded house in the French countryside. Until July 14th, 1976, when someone decided that justice delayed too long becomes justice denied and took matters into their own hands. Was Peiper's death justice or murder? The answer is probably both, and that's what makes this story so disturbing. Because in the gap between what the law provided and what morality demanded, violence became inevitable. Joachim Peiper died the way he lived, surrounded by flames, inflicting violence until the very end, firing his weapons at enemies he couldn't see in the darkness. his body, reduced to a shriveled husk barely recognizable as human, mirrored the charred remains he had created throughout his career. There's something almost biblical about it. The measure you give is the measure you get. But unlike his victims, Peiper had 30 years of freedom before the flames came for him. 30 years to reflect on his crimes, to express remorse, to seek forgiveness. He never did. Until his death, Peiper remained an unrepentant supporter of Hitler and the Nazi regime. He claimed his war crimes convictions were based on false evidence. He insisted he was a soldier following orders. He never acknowledged the humanity of his victims. And so when the fire came, he died alone, unmourned by anyone except his immediate family. The ruins of his house in Traves stood for years as a monument to his final moments. Some visitors came to see where justice had been served. Others came to see where murder had been committed. In 2016, 40 years after Peiper's death, the ruins were still there, a charred skeleton of a building slowly being reclaimed by the French forest. The site has become a dark tourism destination, a place where history's bloodiest chapters intersect with questions of justice, revenge, and morality that have no easy answers. Joachim Peiper's story should serve as a warning. Evil doesn't always look like evil. Peiper was handsome, intelligent, charismatic. His men loved him, his commanders praised him. Nazi propaganda portrayed him as a hero. But beneath the medals and the propaganda, he was a mass murderer who burned people alive and executed prisoners. His death, brutal as it was, came 3 decades too late for his victims, and it came not through proper justice but through vigilante action that itself violated the laws Peiper had spent his career destroying. So what lessons do we draw from this? That war criminals should never feel safe? That justice delayed creates the conditions for vigilante revenge? That some crimes are so monstrous that legal punishment will never feel sufficient? All of these are true, but perhaps the most important lesson is this. The crimes Joachim Peiper committed weren't inevitable. He made choices. At Yevremovka, he chose to lock people in a church and burn them alive. At Malmedy Massacre, he created a command culture where murdering prisoners was acceptable. At every step, he could have chosen differently. He could have followed the laws of war. He could have treated prisoners humanely. He could have refused illegal orders. He chose not to. And 30 years later, on a summer night in France, those choices came back to consume him. What other dark stories from history should we uncover? Are there modern war criminals living comfortably today, believing they've escaped justice? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because the truth is, evil doesn't disappear just because we stop looking for it. Sometimes it takes decades. But eventually, one way or another, the reckoning comes. Just ask Joachim Peiper if you could find anything left of him in the ashes.